afternoon, everyone. It is terrific to be with you this afternoon. It's a bright and sunny day, at least where I am in South Jersey, and I hope it is where you are too. I'm the executive director, Sarah Curitan, of the New Jersey Historical Commission, and today's Lunch and Learn is part of an ongoing series of webinars that we have been offering to highlight different important and engaging aspects of New Jersey history. And this particular offering is very much a part of our year-long focus on memory and memorialization, which was the theme of our annual conference last month. So we're delighted that you can join us today to explore this very important and relevant topic of slavery in New Jersey, its history. We have an exciting presentation for you this afternoon. And to get us started, I do want to turn over the microphone to Dr. Sinatra Smith, who is the project manager for the New Jersey Historical Commission's New Jersey Black Heritage Trail. So with that, let me turn it over to Sinatra Smith.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. We're so excited that you have joined us today, and so that we have enough time for Q&A at the end. So get your questions ready while you're watching the presentation. I'll go ahead and get right into the bio for our speaker, and then I'll pass it over to her so that she can begin the presentation. So Gail R. Safian has been president of the Durand-Hedden House and Garden since July 2021 and a member of the board since 1996. She has expanded the organization's programming to include multi-year collaborations with SOMA Community Coalition on Race, and the programs there cover history, natural history, culture and the arts, research exhibits, and exhibits by local professional and student artists, and imaginative, interactive activities for children. Before retiring, Gail was a recognized leader in healthcare public relations. She has an MBA from the NYU Stern School of Business and a BA in art history and English from SUNY Albany. So again, please make sure as you are listening to her phenomenal presentation that you are coming up with questions, and feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and place your questions in the chat, and we will make sure to get to them at the end of the presentation.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today. This comes out right. Okay. Does that look right, Sinatra?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, this program is about the history of slavery in New Jersey, which is not a pretty sight. We developed this originally as a research exhibit in 2019 when the Durand-Hedden House decided to create a Juneteenth celebration before George Floyd and before the whole Black Lives Matter made this such an important issue. We were celebrating our community, which is very diverse, and we wanted to look into what was going on in New Jersey and its history in relation to slavery. And what we found was that slavery had started in New Jersey from the earliest days, when Dutch and English settlers brought the first African captives to the region in 1626, not long after Jamestown. And the first ship to arrive in New Jersey from Africa reached Perth Amboy in 1686. And by 1664, 1 out of every 8 white New Jersey residents enslaved Black people. In its earliest days as a colony, New Jersey was split into East and West Jersey. The East Jersey was what we would now call North Jersey, and it was predominantly English and Dutch settlers who were accustomed to slavery and were quite comfortable with it. The south and west of Jersey, which was then called West Jersey, was predominantly Quakers, and Quakers had were abolitionists and were fiercely opposed to slavery. And that set the stage for a conflict that would last until the Civil War. In 1745 census showed that 45% of the enslaved people in New Jersey were up here in Bergen, Somerset, Middlesex, and Essex counties. One of the reasons why there weren't as many slaves in New Jersey as there were in the South was that the major crops were wheat, corn, and barley, which were not as labor intensive as the rice and cotton in the South. But this geographical distribution of enslaved people continued until the end of the Civil War. As the years went by in the early 18th century, more and more laws came into effect, enforcing slave codes and creating harsh penalties for the crimes allegedly committed by enslaved people and by fugitives who came from the South, thinking that it would be better in this state. And for the next decades, the colony's laws restricted how far from home enslaved people could travel, how late they could stay out at night, and it made it illegal to harbor fugitive slaves. And enslaved people continued to protest their bondage by seeking freedom, by what we call running away. And the newspapers of the time were filled with what was called runaway slave ads that seemed very perhaps derogatory, but in reality, when you really look at them, it's pretty amazing how the enslaved people were portrayed. This person was an accomplished fiddler. In other ads, they talk about the person being a skilled blacksmith or having other skills. So the white enslavers recognized the value of these people in terms of their abilities and the skills that they brought. But and the ads also describe their clothing, it's very interesting when you read them because it really makes them into real people, even though the intent of these ads was really horrifying. Manumission was something that was available as early as 1713. However, initially, the government made it very difficult for owners of enslaved people to manumit them, which means to give them their freedom. Excuse me. If a slaveholder wanted to free the person, they had to pay the government the equivalent of $56,000 in today's money. And then every year they'd have to give the person they were freeing $5,600 in today's money. You can imagine that was a disincentive to manumitting slaves. There was also a provision later on where enslaved people could buy their own freedom, but that was later. In the Revolutionary War, many enslaved people escaped because of the chaos of what was going on in the war. And sometimes they fought for the Continental Army or the New Jersey militia. And the British Army also promised them freedom if they would fight on the British side. And but in the decades after the war, when America became a nation, the Quakers and other abolitionists were able to achieve some improvements in the status of enslaved people, including the removal of the government payment of today's $56,000. It was also, they got the state to ban the importation of African captives, and there were fines against abusive slaveholders, and also allowed for enslaved people born after 1788. The law required that they be allowed to be taught to read. However, the state also prohibited free Black people from moving into the state. This illustration here is a request for compensation by a slaveholder for the loss of his enslaved worker, Amos Seeley, who was killed in the Revolutionary War. The new northern states of the Union began to abolish slavery in the years immediately following the Revolution. New Jersey was the last northern state to supposedly abolish slavery, which was in 1804. It was called the Gradual Abolition Act. And it actually didn't free anybody immediately. It said every child born of a slave after the 4th of July, 1804, shall be free, but shall remain the servant of the owner until when the males reach the age of 25 and the female reach the age of 21. So anyone born on the 3rd of July, 1804, or any time before that was enslaved and still had no possibility to be free. And also, the slave owners, while they had custody of these people when they were under 25 or 21, they were still able to sell them to the South, which was the worst fear of any enslaved person in the North, because the South treatment of slaves in the South was really horrible. So by 1800, there were 12,422 enslaved people in New Jersey. And but encouragingly, by 1830, 90% of the Black people in the state were free. In 1840, to just give you a picture of the position of New Jersey versus all the other northern states. So in all the northern states in 1840, there were 3,500 enslaved people. 3,000 of them lived in New Jersey, along with almost 18,400 Black people. This map that you see here, the map is from 1834, and we overlaid on it the results of the census of 1830, when they defined people as white, colored, which were free Blacks, and slaves. And here's a close-up of that. And you can see that in the northern counties of New Jersey in 1830, this is where most of the enslaved people were captives, in Bergen, Essex, Somerset, Morris, and Monmouth. And this section over here shows the population of enslaved people in the South, in the southern part of the state where the Quakers resided. There was one slave in Salem County, 4 slaves in Gloucester County, 0 in Cumberland County. So the Quaker population was very strong in carrying out their beliefs against slavery. So between 1804 and 1846, the state did various ways to disguise the fact that they were enslaved people. The general population of slaves for a term increased, and the slaves for a term were these people born after 1804. But still, as I mentioned, the people born before July 4th, 1804 were still enslaved with no hope of liberty. And the state constitution was updated in 1844, but it made no change to the references to slavery, so it left in place the 1798 slavery law, which was pretty awful. And throughout, none of the things none of the laws that were passed did anything to force people that owned slaves from having to get rid of them. So in 1846, trying to be more liberal, but really not, New Jersey claimed to abolish slavery, and what they did actually was they changed the names of enslaved people from being enslaved to being apprentices for life, again having no way to get out of slavery. This image is called "Sold to the South," and it's maybe hard to see, but there's people crying in the background, because when someone was sold from the North to the South, they knew that they would have much worse living conditions and lots more abuse. So the enslaved people weren't sitting around waiting to be rescued. They sometimes negotiated with their owners to be manumitted. And they often published petitions and wrote to their congressional leaders to plead for the end of slavery. And many of them, especially in the southern states, escaped through what became known as the Underground Railroad, which was made possible by the creation of the Rail Railroad in 1829, and that there were many routes to get people to the north, and Britain had abolished slavery completely by 1830. So the goal of people escaping from slavery was to get to Canada until the situation in the United States improved, because even in the North, there was a fugitive slave law, which said that if fugitive enslaved people were found in any northern state, they had to be returned to the South, which was really devastating. So the number of people enslaved in New Jersey decreased by the 1850s, but national tension mounted because it was still very much the way of life in the southern states. And once the Civil War started, many enslaved people fled to the Union Army camps to get protection. And then came in 1863 the Emancipation Proclamation, and that established the colored troops. So for the first time, Black people were able to be soldiers in the Civil War to help fight for their own freedom. And in New Jersey, there was the 6th Regiment, New Jersey Colored Troops, they were called. And they were very brave and suffered a lot of losses in their fighting. So the Emancipation Proclamation's major change was to clarify that the purpose of the war was not fighting secession so much as ending slavery throughout the nation. So people think that the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery. Unfortunately, it did not. It applied only to the Confederate states that were still fighting against the Union. So it did not apply to people living in any states fighting on the Union side, including New Jersey. And it did not apply to people in areas that the Union had already gotten control over. And it also didn't apply to states that were neutral. So what that meant was there was still a lot of work to do. And that is why it became apparent that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments would be needed to end slavery and make slavery obsolete in the whole country, and also to protect the rights of African Americans in all states. But when I was doing this research, I couldn't understand why, after the Emancipation Proclamation, more protection was needed. And as I delved into it, it became so apparent. And the laws that were enacted as part of these amendments are still so critical to us in this day, as we will see. So the 13th Amendment became law in 1865 after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and it said that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. But here again, New Jersey was the recalcitrant member. They rejected ratification in 1865 and finally only ratified it only after it was already law. It was the last northern state to do so. And the amendment freed nearly 4 million enslaved people throughout the North and South. But it was not enough. Excuse me. Southern states began to enact laws that continued to restrict the freedom of Black people. And as the century ended, they became known as the Jim Crow laws. So the 14th Amendment was needed, and that was adopted in 1868, and that was what established what we now call birthright citizenship. But we know how fragile that is, and how we really need to continue to be vigilant. This amendment established citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the U.S., and it required due process of law, which meant that you could not be arrested and jailed arbitrarily. The state could not deprive anyone of life, liberty, or property without due process. And that means without the courts of law being involved. This also enshrined the concept of equal protection under the law, which was an effort to eliminate discrimination against Black citizens. The Equal Protection Law part is still used in many legal cases to protect people whose rights have been violated by various states or groups. But again, that wasn't enough. The 15th Amendment was needed, and that was passed in 1870, and that prohibited the denial of the right to vote, which was happening in the South, based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Of course, it applied only to men, not to women, and it would be another 50 years until women got the right to vote. But that is another story. And Thomas Mundy Peterson of Perth Amboy was the first African-American to vote in the US under universal suffrage. This is an image of the cover of Harper's Weekly, which was a very well-known publication back then. This is showing Thomas Mundy Peterson casting the vote, and it was a very important thing. But as we know, the struggle is not over. Discrimination persists, and many states, even today, are passing increasingly restrictive voting laws. So it's a little bit sad that New Jersey, the situation in New Jersey is now good for all of us, but the fight has not ended for lots of Americans. This material is in a book called Slavery in New Jersey, A Troubled History, and it's available from Durand-Hedden.org. And we hope that you will come and visit Durand-Hedden House in Maplewood. And now open to questions. Sintra?
Sorry about that. I was reading one of the questions. All right. Thank you so much for that presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with our first few questions. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we will get to them. So the first question is from Robert Neal. Robert would like to know, was it common for an enslaved person to be married to a free person in at least some counties?
I don't think it was common, but it did happen. And in some states until, well, we know the case of Loving versus the United States. The miscegenation was what it was called when a Black person married a white person. And that was outlawed in many states until the 70s, 1970s. It's pathetic. You think of that.
All right, our second question comes from Barry Conaway. Barry says, it's been reported that enslaved persons were on Burlington Island as early as 1659 to 1664, per the Burlington County website. Are there other documents that can confirm this fact?
I'm not familiar with them, but I can look into that.
Our next question is from Claire Garland. Claire would like to know, what was the earliest date that you cited for entry of enslaved people in the area that was New Netherland before New Jersey existed?
Into New Jersey?
Mm-hmm.
I think I said 1624, right? It was after Jamestown, but 1626.
Great. Francesca Costa says, how was teaching enslaved people enforced? In my own research, I found many freedmen in the 1800s who were illiterate, though their children could read.
I don't know how that was enforced. And it probably was, I think it was an amazing thing that they passed a law saying that enslaved people had to be taught to read, because that was keeping enslaved people from reading was one of the ways they kept them down. And reading was a very powerful thing. So I don't know how they enforced it, and it's possible that it wasn't enforced, but it's still amazing that it was a law.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that that law was passed when a lot of places it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read. So that might be the actual point of the law versus enforcing it, unfortunately.
Right.
Claude Taylor asks, to what extent did the patterns of residential redlining in New Jersey during the mid 20th century follow the patterns of slaveholding in East Jersey slash West Jersey? Really interesting.
I'm not an expert in that, but what I think that it reveals is that from the earliest days of free blacks, they were kept in certain areas of the city or of the town or of the state even, and they weren't they weren't allowed, even in the earliest days of free black people, they weren't allowed to just live wherever they wanted to. I think that there were areas set aside for them. And I
Mhm.
think redlining kind of grew out of that.
Donato Neiman says Somerset County had a significant number of enslaved people. Was that due to the number of farms in the county?
Probably. So it was a pretty rural county. I mean, even now it has a lot of open land. So the bigger your farm, the more you would need help. And of course, free help is better than having to pay for it. So I
Mhm.
think that accounts for the large number of enslaved people there.
Yeah, and I think that was a really interesting point that you made during your presentation about the way that the reason there was less enslavement is because there was less of a need for labor versus what we know about tobacco and sugar and
And
all of that
cotton,
that were
yeah.
cotton, right, that were produced in
Yeah.
southern states. Um, Peter Leggetti, hopefully I pronounced that right, asked who was the last recorded enslaved person or servant as the language changed. I'm vaguely aware that even after the 13th Amendment, some were recorded as such in a census, but I may be wrong.
That's true. When we exhibit this, we have a picture of a woman who was very old by the end of the Civil War, but um, she, she was technically still enslaved, although she was so old that she probably wasn't made to work. And there are actually in Rosedale Cemetery, there are a couple of gravestones of formerly enslaved people.
Hmm.
There's a whole
Um,
section of them, actually.
Rowena Madden asked, can you speak a bit more about the Underground Railroad in New Jersey? It is my understanding that Native American communities were part of that network.
I'm not familiar with the role of Native Americans, but that's fascinating. But there was the Underground Railroad primarily ran through New Brunswick to Perth Amboy and then into the city, into New York City. The goal was to get them out of New Jersey and into New York City as fast as possible because uh, New York was, as it is today, much more liberal and protective of the Black people trying to escape. But again, it was just like trying to get them through as quickly as possible so they could go up to Canada um, until the end of the Civil War. Oh, excuse
We
me.
have a lot more questions coming. Thank you all so much for putting these in the chat and in the Q&A. So Claire Stewart asks, I think of those enslaved in the South as working in the fields. Where were most enslaved people in New Jersey forced to work? Was it more domestic work or still primarily farm related?
I think the majority were in the farms. Because perhaps in the larger, more wealth landowners had more enslaved people working in the houses, but there was always a greater need in the fields
Where was
and
my
in
next
in
question?
mines. So yeah, that's interesting.
Hmm.
Yeah,
That's actually one thing that we don't talk about a lot in the US, right? Is, or at least on the East Coast, is the work that's done in mines and the
yeah.
ways that enslaved people also contributed to that work.
Hmm.
Petra Tomes, again, hope I pronounced your name correctly, asks, is there evidence of Harriet Tubman traveling through New Jersey? Is the conservative, it's a two-part question. Second question is the conservative nature of some New Jersey counties still impacting the treatment of people of color?
I know that Harriet Tubman got spent a lot of time in Cape May, and there's now a wonderful museum, a Harriet Tubman Museum there. I don't know of her going farther north in New Jersey. Her main goal was to get as much money as she could so she could go back to Maryland and bring as many enslaved people um, into New Jersey to get them on their way north to New York and up to Canada. And
Mhm.
the so the in regard to conservative people, it's really interesting when you look at the old maps of New Jersey and the Quakers being in the South. You know, now I think it's fair to say that northern New Jersey is more liberal and southern New Jersey is more conservative. Probably not for every person and not in every area. Certainly, the area around Philadelphia is quite liberal, but so it's funny how it has changed, I think. But based on the recent governor race, I think there's a lot of blue people everywhere.
Yeah, if we look at those electoral maps, the
Yeah,
voting
yeah, and
does
this, you
show
know,
that
the
there's a
counties
lot
that
of
flipped
blue.
from the previous election to this one. Yeah.
Hmm. Um, our fearless executive director, Sarah Curitan, asks, can you tell us about how audiences have received this project at your museum? Has there been a lot of interest?
Well, as I mentioned, this was originally an exhibit on the walls of the museum, and we mount it every year when we do our Juneteenth event. And people of all ages, children and adults, um, especially back in the early days when, you know, when there wasn't that much information about it, people came in and just stopped in their tracks. And the children, like there were middle school children who said, how come I didn't learn this in school? Why didn't anyone tell me this? I mean, people were really shocked in general. And I think to some extent that continues um, because, again, we think of New Jersey as a northern state, and unless you get into the details of it, you don't realize the history. But I think most people were shocked and aghast that they never learned about it before, and um, and there were no negative comments by anyone.
Well,
And
we love
actually,
that.
one thing I will say is one young Black man said, well, why should I look at this exhibit? Because it was written by a white woman. And my response was that white people have to know about this history too. That this is just as important for white people to know as it is for Black people to know.
Yeah, it goes to the phrase that we often repeat that Black history is American history. And so we all have
Exactly.
to learn it. And unfortunately, we don't learn it in public schools typically. It's not, something that they're asking about on standardized tests. It's not going to make or break your acceptance into a college program or anything like that. And so a lot of it is curiosity, unfortunately, but also it's great that there are so many curious folks, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Patricia Donahue asks, can you comment on the Van Wyck kidnapping ring in Middlesex County?
No, I'm sorry. I don't know anything about it.
And then Donato Neiman asked another question, which is, are there any surviving slave cabins or homes in New Jersey?
I think that there are down in southern New Jersey. There's actually there's a town called Lawnside that I know about. There was a family called Still that was a very prominent of free Black people, and There was one still who was a doctor. And in the town of Lawnside, there's a lot of buildings that are related to the Still family. And there's a lot of history that is explained there.
And I'll just throw a shameless plug in there for the Black Heritage Trail that we've installed a marker at the Dr. James Still office site already, in, I believe, either the end of September, I think it was the end of September. And we are also going to be installing one at Lawnside. That was in a historic Black community, and so that's coming. And we just unveiled one in Timbuktu for that community that was established by free and enslaved folks. So check out our Black Heritage Trail sites.
Yeah, there's a lot to learn.
A lot.
Yeah.
Gail Rogers says Warren County has rural farm sections, but the map did not indicate it as a slave county. Was there enslavement in Warren County?
The 1830 census says there were 56 slaves there. That was it was kind of bisected by East and West Jersey at the time. So not I'm not sure about how many Quakers there were in that area, but in the earlier days before 1705, it was certainly influenced by the Quakers. And one thing about Hunterdon and Warren is that they did a lot of trade with Philadelphia. So there was a lot more business, and that may have added to why there were more enslaved people there than in the southern part of the state.
All right. I know this is like boom, 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 but people have so many questions. This is wonderful. Claude Taylor says, Gail, can you say more about what you think the impact of this historical record has had or will have on social dynamics among folks in New Jersey? Ooh.
I can only speak to the experience of viewers at our house museum, and I think, and it's so tied in with our Juneteenth event, and our Juneteenth event attracts hundreds of people, depending on the weather, and we have as many white people as Black people that come to that event. We have historical reenactors, we have African drummers and line dancing, and it's very exciting. And I think that understanding the history, and then through our Juneteenth event and other things we do in collaboration with the South Orange Maplewood Community Coalition on Race, I think it advances our philosophy of not only diversity, but of appreciation of each other, and understanding that we're more alike than different.
Mm-hmm. Robert Neal asks, any knowledge of Native Americans owning Black enslaved people in New Jersey?
I'm not familiar with any, but I didn't really research that, so I wouldn't say.
Frank Gerard Godlewski, hopefully I pronounced that right.
Frank, I know Frank.
Says, thank you so much for the book. It's valuable to me for the new information. I've heard that in Bergen County, some formerly enslaved persons continued to live as enslaved up until the 1900s. Was it because it was too problematic for a former enslaved person to live as a free citizen?
It's possible. It was hard that the jobs that Black people could get were limited, and maybe they were in a situation, I don't know, so I'm speculating, but maybe they were in a comfortable situation with a family that treated them well, and they, that freed them from having to look for housing, which would be difficult to find, and and food, and so it depends. And maybe they were older by then, and it was more difficult for them to adapt to living on their own. I don't know.
And the last question we have, I just looked through the chat. I don't see any additional ones. From Elizabeth Wolf. Does the Durand-Hedden House have a standing exhibit on African American history, either enslavement in New Jersey or African American history of Maplewood, or is it just mounted for Black History Month?
We are a very small house museum, very small, and our exhibit space is limited. So we try to we have different exhibits throughout the year, and but we always mount this exhibit for the Juneteenth. We also have uh, programs for Black History Month in February, and this year we're combining Black history with the Revolutionary War, and we're having a historical reenactor named Leslie Bramlett, who reenacts Hannah Till. And Hannah Till was a Black woman who worked for George Washington during the Revolutionary War. So she has a lot of interesting stories to tell. And then after the Revolution, she bought her freedom, but continued to work for Washington. And then we'll also have on the walls an exhibit of beautiful boxes of like story boxes by a very talented artist named Beverly McCutcheon. So you never know what you're going to find at Durand-Hedden, but if you check our website, there's always something interesting. And we love collaborating with the Community Coalition on Race, and we do it whenever possible.
Oh, wow. Okay, more questions are popping up. We only have a couple minutes left. So, first question, there were a number of AME churches in New Jersey. What influence may they have had on the Black community?
I'm sure they have a very well. I mean, originally, in some places, Black people weren't allowed in church, or they had to be in the balcony, or depending on how big the church was, or they had to be in the back. And as you may know, that led to the development of AME churches, because they wanted to have their own place to worship without being told where to sit. And I'm not an expert on that, but I believe it was a very strong influence in the Black community.
Absolutely. And we have several AME churches on the Black Heritage Trail, and other non-AME churches, Baptist churches, all different types of denominations, but that's exactly it. They often were the linchpin for the community, where they also established a school for the children. They also would have have a cemetery to bury the dead, have programming and other ways to help their local community. So if you want to learn more about that, definitely check out the Black Heritage Trail. So, so I know there are some other questions in the chat. Unfortunately, we do need to go ahead and wrap up. So I just want to thank you first, Gail, for this amazing presentation. This is a super active Q&A, which I think is evidence of everyone really enjoying what you spoke about today and the information that you shared. I also would like to pass it back over to Sarah to close us out, perhaps. And I see lots of thank yous popping up in the chat. Lots of resources were shared in the chat. I hope you all were able to grab a lot of those.
There we go. Thank you so much, Sinatra, for handing it back, and to Gail for a wonderful participation, or presentation, I should say. And let me thank everyone who joined us today, because what a lively conversation we've had. I look forward to continuing it in future presentations. So thank you all. Have a great weekend.